A young couple vanishes without a trace during a camping trip in the Mojave Desert, leaving behind only a haunting photo. 11 years later, a lone hiker stumbles upon something buried in the sand, human remains. But what he uncovers isn't just a mystery. It's the beginning of a dark revelation that will drag investigators into the heart of an ancient, twisted ritual where the desert itself is alive with secrets and the dead don't rest. What really happened to Chris and Emily? And are they the last victims or the first? Mojave, a desert full of life despite its apparent silence. Sand dunes, as high as a few stories, glittering in the sun like golden threads. This place seems to lead people to tranquility, making them forget about time and everyday worries. For Chris and Emily, this desert was a perfect place for their last getaway before the arrival of their first child. They were young, full of hope and dreams. Chris and Emily, a couple planning their life together, deciding to escape the noise of the city for a few days in solitude before everything would change. Emily, 8 months pregnant, saw this trip as their last chance to be alone together before becoming parents. The baby was due soon, and they dreamed of a new beginning with the desert, its peace and vastness, seeming like the perfect backdrop for that transition. They took their tent, camping gear, and headed to one of the most remote areas of the Mojave National Park. The journey wasn't easy. The desert didn't forgive mistakes, but they both felt confident. Chris, with his calm and assured nature, always reassured Emily, even as she grew more concerned about the impending birth. He told her that they would be safe, that the desert, despite its beauty, wasn't dangerous. This was their trip, their time together, and nothing should ruin it. The couple set up camp at the base of one of the dunes. In the evening, as the sun began to sink into the horizon, Emily took a few photos, the first and the last she would take on this trip. They sat by the campfire, enjoying the silence and the grandeur of the surrounding nature. Chris snapped one last photo of Emily, who smiled, gently stroking her belly. It was their last picture together. "One last shot before everything changes," Chris said, pointing the camera at Emily. Emily smiled and looked into the lens. She was happy, despite the underlying anxiety that tugged at her heart. They both knew this was their final moment of peace before they became parents. But it wasn't sad. It was exciting, hopeful, as if they were both embarking on a new, unknown journey. But, unfortunately, that photo would become their last memory. The next few hours were spent in the silence of the desert, swallowed up by the starlit sky. Chris and Emily walked along the sand dunes to enjoy one last evening breeze and the beauty of the sunset. That moment when the world feels so far away and everything around you is just you and your partner. The passing day, the quiet wind, and the desert that seemed to live and breathe around them. They walked along the dunes, talking, laughing, and despite the tension, their conversation was light and easy. No one knew this would be the last time they were seen. It was too peaceful, too serene for anyone to think that anything might go wrong. When they didn't return to camp that night, no one suspected anything unusual. They could have simply gotten lost. Perhaps they had decided to watch the sunrise on the other side of the desert, but the day turned into night, and then morning came, and still they hadn't returned. When they didn't come back, people began to worry. The next morning, Chris and Emily were not at the camp. Their tent remained untouched. Their belongings were in place, but they were gone. It marked the beginning of the search. Local authorities and rescuers acted quickly, but the search yielded no results. Day after day, the desert swallowed their traces, and there was no sign of where Chris and Emily could be. It wasn't a kidnapping. There was no sign of violence. Only one explanation remained. They had simply vanished. No one knew what had really happened, but the desert had become their grave, where time slowed down and consumed everything. The investigation continued. There were many theories, from the idea that the couple had run away to the possibility of a random accident, but each theory ended without evidence. Time passed, and it seemed as if their disappearance had become just another story. But for their families, for those who knew them, hope remained. Even though none of the investigations had led to real leads, they believed that someday the truth would surface. But no one could have predicted that the truth was waiting to be uncovered by someone who would finally reveal it. 11 years had passed since Chris and Emily's disappearance. Their faces, once seen on missing person posters, had faded from the memories of most. The search efforts dwindled to whispers, their names becoming part of the past, a tragic chapter that was no longer active. Investigators had long stopped pursuing the case, the trail growing cold as the desert had swallowed every clue, every trace. Their families, however, never gave up hope. Each year, they would return to the desert, their hearts heavy with the hope that something, anything, might bring closure. Chris's parents, still living in the same house where he had grown up, often spent nights looking through old photos, remembering the boy they had lost. Emily's mother, a quiet woman who had always hoped for a different fate, still wore a locket with a photo of her daughter and son-in-law. Every year, they held a small gathering, hoping for answers, even as the years stretched on and the search remained fruitless. For the police, the case had become just another unsolved mystery, filed away and forgotten, a ghost in their archives. Theories had ranged from the plausible to the absurd, everything from a simple accident to the idea that they had run away, leaving behind no more than a few scattered belongings. But nothing made sense and nothing came of it. Then, on a crisp autumn morning, the impossible happened. A lone hiker, a man in his mid-40s named Jack, who frequented the park in search of solitude, was walking along a remote trail when something unusual caught his eye. The vast, empty stretch of sand seemed endless, but Jack's gaze was drawn to something that didn't belong. It was faint, barely visible at first, but something in the terrain was off. As he stepped closer, he noticed what appeared to be a small piece of fabric protruding from the sand. At first, he thought it was just a rag or some leftover trash from a hiker who had passed through. But when he knelt down and brushed away the sand, his heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a rag. It was a boot, old and weathered, but unmistakably human. Jack's mind raced. It wasn't just the boot. As he continued to dig, he uncovered more. A small piece of cloth, a fragment of a torn shirt, and then, beneath the sand, something much more chilling, a partial human skull. His stomach churned, and he quickly stood up, backing away from the sight. This wasn't just a hiker's abandoned belongings. This was something far darker. Panic began to set in, but he forced himself to pull out his phone and call for help. It wasn't long before investigators arrived, the scene quickly turning into an excavation. Forensic teams were dispatched, and the news reached Chris and Emily's families. As the bodies were unearthed from the sand, it was confirmed. The remains were those of Chris and Emily. The relief of finding them was quickly replaced by horror as the forensic team began their analysis. These were not remains that had simply succumbed to the harsh conditions of the desert. Something was wrong. The bodies were partially skeletal, but the marks on the bones were unmistakable. Strange, deliberate cuts and symbols carved into their remains. The desert had kept them hidden, but it had also revealed a horrifying truth. The investigators were baffled. This was no simple disappearance. The bodies showed signs of torture and ritualistic mutilation. Strange symbols were etched into the bones, symbols that did not belong to any known culture or tribe in the area. The markings were unfamiliar to the experts, leaving them with more questions than answers. Jack, the hiker who had found them, became the key witness in a case that would unravel far more than anyone could have anticipated. The scene was puzzling, but it also sparked something in the investigators. They would no longer deal with a case of simple disappearance. Something much darker had taken place in that remote section of the Mojave Desert. The truth, which had been buried for over a decade, was finally coming to light, but it was a truth none of them were prepared for. And as the investigation deepened, it became clear that the couple's death was no random accident or simple misfortune. Something far more sinister had happened. Something tied to the land itself. What started as a missing person case was now a search for answers that would expose long-buried secrets, mysteries, and horrors that had been hidden beneath the sand for far too long. The discovery of Chris and Emily's remains sent shockwaves through the investigation, and what was once a seemingly ordinary case of a couple gone missing had now become something far more disturbing. Forensic experts began working around the clock, studying every detail of the skeletal remains, searching for clues that could shed light on what had truly happened. As they carefully examined the bones, it became clear that the mutilations were not random. The markings were precise and deliberate, etched into the bones with unnatural precision. They were symbols, ancient, complex, and deeply unsettling. The investigators called in specialists, including archaeologists and experts in obscure religious practices, to help decode the markings. But no one could place them. They were not part of any known indigenous or historical cultures that had inhabited the region. The symbols seemed to point to something darker, something that didn't belong in the vast emptiness of the Mojave Desert. There were theories. Some believed that the couple had unknowingly stumbled upon a hidden cult, while others speculated that the symbols were part of a ritualistic killing designed to appease something far older, something tied to the land itself. But no one could explain why Chris and Emily, who had no known connection to any such groups, had been chosen as victims. The investigation turned its focus to the area surrounding the discovery site. A team of cadaver dogs was brought in, and they combed the dunes for any additional remains or evidence. What they uncovered next was even more chilling. Deep in the sand, beneath layers of dirt and dust, they found more disturbing signs, remnants of other objects, bones from small animals, fragments of broken pottery, and shards of metal tools that didn't seem to belong to any modern-day hikers. It was as though the desert had been hiding a history of its own, one that had been forgotten, buried under centuries of sand. But the most horrifying find was yet to come. While combing through a patch of land near where Chris and Emily's bodies were discovered, a member of the team uncovered something that made their blood run cold. A stone altar, partially buried in the sand. The altar, made of weathered rock, had symbols carved into it, symbols that matched those found on the remains. It appeared to be the site of a ritual, an altar where sacrifices were made long before Chris and Emily had ever set foot in the desert. The discovery of the altar made the investigation take a sharp turn. The team began to theorize that the desert, long seen as a vast, lifeless expanse, was actually a site of ancient and forbidden rituals. It became clear that Chris and Emily had unknowingly walked into a trap set by something far older than them. The symbols, the altar, the remains. It was all connected to a history of cult-like practices that had been hiding in plain sight. As the investigation deepened, so did the questions. How had Chris and Emily found their way to this cursed part of the desert? The more they learned, the more it seemed that the couple's disappearance had been no accident. They had been lured to this remote area, where the desert had claimed them and hidden the truth for over a decade. There were whispers among the investigators, rumors of a shadowy group that operated in the background of the Mojave Desert, performing secretive rituals under the cover of night. It was said that these rituals had been going on for centuries, with no one the wiser. And now, it appeared that Chris and Emily had unwittingly become part of that dark history. To find answers, the investigators reached out to experts in occult practices, hoping they might unlock the final piece of the puzzle. One such expert, Dr. Evelyn Morrow, a professor of anthropology with a specialty in ancient cults, was brought in to examine the symbols. Her initial reaction was shock. "These symbols," she said, staring at the photographs of the carvings on the bones and the altar, "are not just random. They are part of a much older belief system, one that dates back to pre-colonial times. These are rituals tied to the worship of ancient deities, beings that were thought to reside in the earth itself. These people believed that by offering sacrifices, they could appease these beings and gain their favor." Dr. Morrow's revelation sent chills down the spines of the investigators. Could it be possible that Chris and Emily had stumbled upon something so ancient, so secret, that it had been hidden in the desert for centuries? And if so, what exactly had happened to them? Were they victims of a ritual gone wrong? Or had they been chosen as sacrifices for something much darker? As the investigation moved forward, a sense of dread began to take hold. The more they uncovered, the more it seemed that Chris and Emily had been just the latest victims in a long line of disappearances tied to the desert's dark past. It was as if the land itself was protecting the secrets buried beneath it, keeping the truth hidden from the world. The investigators were left with more questions than answers, but one thing was becoming painfully clear. The Mojave Desert was not just a place of isolation and beauty. It was a place where ancient forces still held sway, and Chris and Emily had unknowingly walked into their grasp. The case had only just begun, but already it was clear that the truth would not come easily. The desert had its secrets, and now it was up to the investigators to uncover them, no matter how horrifying they might be. As the investigation progressed, the horror of what Chris and Emily had experienced began to unfold in disturbing detail. The discovery of the altar, combined with the chilling symbols on their remains, was only the beginning of what would soon become a tangled web of ancient rituals and dark forces that still lingered in the Mojave Desert. The more they uncovered, the more the investigators realized that Chris and Emily were not simply victims of an isolated act of violence. They had stumbled upon something far older, something that had been hiding beneath the surface of the desert for centuries. The search for answers led the team to the few remaining experts who had studied ancient desert rituals and indigenous practices. But the more they learned, the more disquieting the findings became. It was not just a case of an isolated cult. It seemed as if Chris and Emily's deaths were part of a much larger, more systematic pattern of disappearances in the desert. Disappearances that had gone uninvestigated for decades. A deep, unsettling connection was starting to form. This connection tied the couple to other missing persons cases from the past, some stretching back almost a century. The authorities had never linked these disappearances before, but the discovery of the altar, along with the strange markings in the bones, made it impossible to ignore the possibility that Chris and Emily were just the latest in a long line of victims chosen for something far more sinister. While the team pored over old records, they began to uncover a series of disappearances that stretched far beyond Chris and Emily. The first case was from the late 1800s, when a group of settlers vanished without a trace while traveling through the Mojave Desert. In the decades that followed, more and more reports surfaced of travelers, hikers, and even locals disappearing in the same region. Each case dismissed by authorities as isolated incidents or misfortunes, never linked together as part of a larger pattern. The breakthrough came when an old local historian named Albert Wright was contacted. Albert had spent his youth exploring the desert and had heard countless stories of strange occurrences from the locals. He was one of the last people alive who remembered the old tales. Stories of rituals performed by secret groups that lived off the grid, in the depths of the desert. According to Albert, these groups had been practicing ancient rites for centuries, attempting to commune with forgotten gods and forces buried in the earth. He had always dismissed the stories as folklore, but now, as the investigators pressed him for more details, he began to reveal what he knew. They called themselves the Guardians, Albert explained. An old group of people who believed that by sacrificing others, they could appease the desert gods. These so-called gods, they believed, lived beneath the earth, underneath the very sand we walk on, and they claimed that as long as the desert remained undisturbed, the land would provide, but if disturbed, it would claim the souls of the unworthy. Albert went on to explain that the desert, with its unforgiving vastness, had been seen by some as a living entity, one that demanded respect and appeasement. The Guardians, a group of mystics and desert-dwelling cultists, had made it their mission to maintain this balance, offering sacrifices to the gods in exchange for favor and protection. Over the years, they had grown more secretive, more elusive, and their rituals grew more sinister, until they disappeared entirely, leaving behind only legends and rumors. But according to Albert, the group had never truly left. Over time, members of the Guardians had scattered, but they had left behind a legacy. And that legacy, it seemed, had found its way to Chris and Emily. The Guardians, Albert muttered under his breath. They still live on in the desert. Their practices have been passed down, sometimes by word of mouth, sometimes in the shadows, but they never truly disappeared. As unsettling as it was, the investigation into the Guardians provided the final link that connected Chris and Emily to the dark history of the Mojave Desert. It was no longer just a question of how they had died. It was now a question of why. What had they stumbled upon that led them to the altar? Were they chosen, or had they simply wandered too close to the truth? The team decided to shift focus. Rather than continuing to dig for answers in the bones and artifacts, they would go deeper into the desert itself, to find what the Guardians had left behind. They needed to understand the full scope of the rituals and the powers at play, because the more they learned, the more they realized that the desert was hiding more than just ancient relics. It was guarding something far darker, something still active, still hungry. In the dead of night, the team set out with a full contingent of searchers, headed for the furthest reaches of the park. Armed with maps, new leads, and a deeper understanding of the local lore, they ventured into the most remote sections of the Mojave Desert, hoping to find something, anything, that could lead them to the truth. The desert, however, had its own plans. As they pushed forward, the landscape began to feel more oppressive, as if they were no longer visitors, but intruders in a place that had long been forgotten by the world. The air grew heavy, the silence deafening, and there were moments when the wind seemed to whisper in their ears, reminding them that they were not alone. In a narrow canyon, deep within the desert, the team made another discovery. This time, it was more than just bones or ancient relics. They found signs of recent activity, disturbed sand, fresh footprints, and what appeared to be makeshift structures hidden in the shadows. The guardians, or what remained of them, were still out there. And now, they knew that Chris and Emily hadn't just been victims. They had been part of something much larger, something that had been pulling at the desert's ancient threads for centuries. And that something, as it turned out, was still very much alive. The deeper the investigators delved into the Mojave Desert, the more the line between reality and myth blurred. The discoveries were growing more horrifying by the hour, disturbing artifacts, strange symbols, and now, physical evidence that someone or something had been living in these remote sections of the desert, far from the prying eyes of civilization. They had uncovered the shadow of an ancient practice, a ritualistic cult that had been dormant for years, but was now reawakening. The guardians, or whatever remained of them, were real, and their purpose was far darker than anyone had imagined. In the heart of the canyon, the team found something that sent chills down their spines. A series of makeshift huts and a large stone circle, arranged in a way that mimicked the ancient rituals Albert Wright had described. The circle, roughly 30 feet in diameter, was surrounded by faded symbols that matched those found on the remains of Chris and Emily. The team realized that they had discovered an active ceremonial site, one that had been used for sacrifices, and most disturbingly, the ritual performed on Chris and Emily wasn't the first. As they carefully examined the site, they found signs that suggested the rituals had continued, albeit in secret. Scraps of human clothing, broken bones, and half-buried objects scattered across the site were chilling evidence that these ceremonies hadn't ended with the disappearance of Chris and Emily. Someone, perhaps the last members of the Guardians, had been watching the desert, waiting for the next victim. The atmosphere was heavy, thick with the weight of the past. It was as if the very land itself was complicit in these dark acts. A sense of dread began to settle over the investigators as they realized that the couple hadn't just been chosen randomly. They had been marked for a reason, perhaps because they had ventured too close to the truth, too close to something buried in the desert's depths. In the center of the stone circle, the investigators uncovered a hidden pit, an offering pit. Inside, they found remnants of previous sacrifices, animals, bones, and what appeared to be remains of human fingers, carefully arranged in a circle, as if the desert itself had accepted the offering. But as they sifted through the dirt and debris, one of the team members unearthed something far more disturbing. A weathered journal, its pages yellowed and fragile with age. The journal, when translated, contained details about the Guardians' rituals, their beliefs, and most unsettling of all, mentions of their most recent sacrifice, Chris and Emily. The journal described how the cultists, in their quest to commune with the ancient desert gods, had begun to select victims who unwittingly ventured into their territory. Chris and Emily had unknowingly become part of this dark history. Their deaths were not random. They had been chosen, and the ritual that had claimed their lives was designed to summon something ancient, something tied to the very earth they had walked upon. As the investigators read on, they discovered that the Guardians had not just been performing rituals for personal gain or power. The cult believed that the Mojave Desert was a gateway to another realm, a place where forgotten gods resided, ancient beings that thrived on blood and sacrifice. The more sacrifices they made, the more powerful they believed the gods would become. The ultimate goal was to open a rift between the worlds, to allow these gods to rise again and reclaim the land as their own. The cult had been operating in the shadows for centuries, hidden from the world, but their influence had never truly disappeared. Chris and Emily had unwittingly crossed into this territory, and once they did, there was no turning back. They had been marked, used to appease the ancient beings the Guardians worshipped. With this revelation, the team's worst fears were confirmed. The deaths of Chris and Emily had been part of a larger, darker plan, a plan that had been in motion for longer than anyone could have imagined. And now, it seemed, The cult was preparing for something even more horrific. A final, grand ritual to awaken the ancient gods. A ritual that would require a much larger sacrifice. As the investigators pieced the puzzle together, they realized the truth was far more terrifying than they had ever expected. Chris and Emily's deaths were just the beginning. The Guardians were not just isolated fanatics. They were part of something much larger, something that had the potential to spread beyond the desert. Their cult, though fractured and hidden, was still active, and their plans had not been foiled. The awakening of the desert gods was still on the horizon. The team knew that they couldn't allow this ritual to happen. They couldn't let the cult succeed in their attempt to tear open the fabric of reality itself. But as they gathered their findings, ready to bring the truth to light, the desert had other plans. In the dead of night, as the team prepared to leave the canyon and report their findings, they heard it. The faint sound of chanting carried on the wind. It came from deeper in the desert, from the direction of the altar. The cultists were still out there. They hadn't finished their ritual. The team realized they were no longer just investigators. They were the last line of defense against something far older and more powerful than they had ever imagined. But as they moved toward the source of the chanting, they understood that this wasn't just about stopping a cult. This was about stopping an ancient evil from rising again. They weren't alone in the desert anymore. Something was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. And they knew they were running out of time. The final confrontation had begun, and the fate of the world now rested on their shoulders. The wind howled across the empty desert, a cold, eerie sound that carried the distant chanting to the ears of the investigators. The team, armed with their findings and determination, pressed forward through the darkness. Every step felt like a step deeper into the unknown, into a place where the laws of nature no longer applied, where the ancient powers of the Mojave were awakening. The chanting grew louder, and with it, a sense of impending doom settled over them. They arrived at the stone circle where the cultists had gathered, their figures barely visible in the dim light. Around the altar, the remaining guardians stood in a circle, their heads bowed, their hands raised in the air, as if invoking something far beyond this world. At the center of the circle, a massive stone slab had been moved, revealing a gaping chasm in the earth. The air around it felt charged, thick with something primal. The desert had always been a place of quiet, but now it felt alive with anticipation. The cultists, oblivious to the approaching investigators, continued their incantations, their voices rising in unison, louder and more frantic with each passing moment. The leader of the Guardians, an older man with wild, unkempt hair, stood at the head of the circle. His eyes were wide with fervor, and his voice trembled with excitement as he recited the final words of the ritual. It was clear. The opening of the rift was imminent. The ancient gods, the ones the cult had worshipped for centuries, were about to be released from their prison beneath the earth. The investigators knew they had no time to waste. With a signal from their leader, they rushed forward, their footsteps muffled by the sand. But just as they neared the circle, a blinding flash of light erupted from the center of the stone slab, and a deep, guttural roar filled the air, so loud that it felt as though the earth itself was trembling. The cultists stumbled back in fear, but it was too late. The rift had opened, and what emerged was not a god, but something far worse, a being half human, half monster, writhing in the air, its form shifting and twisting in the light of the moon. Its eyes were the color of burning embers, its voice a chorus of thousands of voices, each one filled with rage and hunger. The investigators stood frozen, their bodies paralyzed by fear. They had uncovered the truth, but now it was too late to stop it. The desert had claimed Chris and Emily, but now it was ready to claim them all. But in that moment of terror, one of the investigators, Dr. Evelyn Morrow, remembered something. She had studied the rituals, the symbols, the writings, and the journal. She knew that the key to closing the rift lay in one final, ancient incantation. She grabbed the journal from her pack and began to recite the words, her voice trembling but steady. The monster roared, its form stretching toward them. But as Dr. Morrow continued the incantation, a surge of energy pulsed through the desert, and the creature faltered. The sand beneath their feet began to shift, and with a final cry, the creature was pulled back into the chasm, vanishing as the rift slowly began to close. The desert fell silent once more, the unnatural charge in the air dissipating. leaving only the sound of the wind. The guardians, their faces twisted with both fear and relief, scattered into the desert, disappearing into the shadows from which they had come. The investigators, their hearts still racing, stood in the aftermath. They had stopped the ritual, but the cost had been high. Chris and Emily were gone, sacrificed to the desert gods, and the truth of what happened to them would never be fully understood by the world. But they had uncovered the darkness that had been hiding beneath the Mojave for centuries, and in doing so, they had saved countless others from the same fate. As the team made their way back to civilization, they knew they could never truly escape the desert. Its secrets were too deep, too old to be forgotten. The Mojave would always keep its mysteries close, guarding them with its unforgiving silence. The case of Chris and Emily would never be forgotten, but it was a story that would remain hidden, known only to those who had dared to seek the truth beneath the sand. And as the last of the investigators left the desert behind, the wind whispered softly in their ears, carrying with it a warning that would echo through the ages. Some things are meant to stay buried,